Long story short, the new series by BoJack Horseman creator Raphael Bob Waksberg is out now, and I imagine there must have been some pressure on him and his team making this new show. This isn't the first animated series that Raphael has done since BoJack. He co-created Undone on Prime with Katie Purdy, but this is his return to animated comedy, as well as producing a show for Netflix where BoJack was a hit. I can only assume the worry to try and replicate that success with a new show. That said, Long Story Short made the smart move in setting itself apart from its creator's past work so it can carve out its own identity. That's what we're going to cover in this video, how Long Story Short works as a series on its own. There will be some inevitable comparisons to BoJack for sure, but only to highlight what makes the show work. Light spoilers ahead, but I'll try to keep that to a minimum as we cover what gives Long Story Short its own identity. Let's do this. Alright internet, whenever a new animated show comes out, be it a comedy or otherwise, you cannot ignore the art style, so let's start there. A show needs to be unique enough to stand out, like how the Seth MacFarlane comedies look different than The Simpsons or South Park, but also be easy enough to be animated. Even though things are rarely hand-drawn frame by frame anymore, the more complicated a character's design is, the harder it is to put in motion. Look at something like Arcane, where characters have so many little bits that need to move in a realistic way to give us the feeling of it being tangible. Animated comedies tend to have tight budgets, so you need to keep your character design simple to make the motion easier to do episode after episode. This goes all the way back to Hanna-Barbera, often giving their characters something going on around the neck to divide the head and body so they could use a still frame of the body during dialogue scenes and only have to animate the heads to keep costs down. This is a long-winded way to say that when a new series comes out, especially in the streaming era when you are scrolling past dozens on dozens of shows, you need to find a balance between your style being simple enough to produce and eye-catching enough to stand out. This is something I think Long Story Short does a great job with. I'm sure that some people will be turned off by this, just like there were when Bob's Burgers first started airing, or with Common Side Effects from just earlier this year. But I think this really works. The character models for Long Story Short evoke the feeling of a kid's drawings that are stuck up on a fridge, and I think that's great tying it into this being a show about family. This begins with the character designs generally to more subtle details like the line work being a bit rough as if drawn by hand, but my favorite choice is the coloring. Long Story Short doesn't go for a fully natural palette, with the family's very pinkish skin tone as a prime example. Combine that with the lack of highlights and shadows in most scenes, and it feels like it was done by a kid with crayons, just solid colors for one thing and then the next, just done in a more refined way. And even then, some of the animation does tend to look a little rougher with the establishing shots, for example, which is fantastic. It even affects how the background characters are done with far less detail and are colored more monochromatic. And they end up standing out less because, like if a kid was drawing their family at an event, the people they know would be drawn with more detail than strangers. These style choices don't take away from the animation or make it feel cheap. The motion is nice and fluid, and the team isn't afraid of throwing in some exciting flourishes when needed. I don't want you to misconstrue my talking of animation budgets as calling the show cheap, because it is not. It is extremely well done and uses the medium in a fun way. But that is enough of that. We should talk about the show's narrative. Raphael Bob Waksberg's previous Netflix show, BoJack Horseman, followed its titular protagonist and the people around him in an almost workplace comedy style premise, at least initially. Long Story Short, on the other hand, leans into a more classic sitcom setup of being a family show. As long as they have been making cartoon shows for grown-ups, there have been family sitcoms. Starting with the Flintstones all the way to The Simpsons and the flood of shows that have come from its success, families have always been a major focus for animated sitcoms. Long Story Short stands out from the rest by its unique premise of telling the story in a non-linear way. BoJack tapped into this as it went on, with some of the most impactful episodes jumping through time to delve deep in onto the traumas of the Horseman family, like with the episode The Old Sugarman Place. Raphael bob-waksberg has clearly built off of that storytelling structure to explore the nuances and difficulties of family here. Each episode of Long Story Short mainly focuses on a single event, but the episodes are not told chronologically. Each episode tells its own focused story on one of the main characters at a pivotal moment in their lives, and have some non-linear moments to help emphasize them. With episode 1 as our example, it has a cold open set in 1996 and a stinger at the end in 2022. This shows how events in our past affect how they are in our present, in this case 2004, and how our actions in the present affect our future, like in that 2022 stinger. The other episodes don't really have a flash forward stinger like that first one does, but they do all have those opening moments in a past part of the timeline. That is the major thrust of the show, how traumas both big and small influence how we live our lives going forward. It is a really cool way to go about storytelling, and this is the kind of thing I am really into. How you tell a story defines a story as much as any other choice you make, and they really nailed this unique structure. It also allows for some really fun forms of setup and payoff. There's a moment in the cold open of episode 2 that is a subtle setup for something in the cold open of episode 3, which then plays on into the episode proper. And there are plenty of other small motifs throughout the season that I'm sure will be compiled by people into Easter egg videos. Videos that I will eat up because that kind of stuff can be so fun. At the center of Long Story Short are the characters. The visuals and fun structures don't mean anything if you don't have compelling characters to watch, and I think this show nails it. My biggest issue with the show is, because the episodes focus on a singular story, we don't get every character in every episode like you get from most typical shows with a standard A and B plot. It is a small nitpick, because the trade-off is the brilliant structure, and I wouldn't change that. It is just a testament to how much I enjoy watching these characters that is my biggest complaint. The Schwooper family is not nearly as broad in their personas and comedy as the leads of BoJack, but in a great way. That said, the youngest son Yoshi does have pretty strong shades of Todd, but I digress. Long Story Short is much more low-key of a show, something that makes sense thinking of the subject matter. While BoJack is about taking huge cartoonish characters and giving them depth and humanity, this show starts from a more human place. Part of that humanity is drawn out by delving into their specificities. This isn't the story about an American family, this is the story about the Schwooper family. Small details, like how the kids' last names are a mashup of the parents' last names, Schwartz and Cooper, and then Shira's kids having the hyphenated last name of Hooper Schwooper. These things let us infer so much about the characters and the time they are from. Same thing can be said about their Jewish American upbringing and how the parents and kids' generations do or don't connect with their heritage in different ways. It defines these characters and their actions for better or worse, and when you compare that to The Simpsons, who go to a Christian church but doesn't really define them in any major way for like 98% of the episodes. This is not an exact figure and should not be treated as such. This is just some guy on the internet with no hard data to back up his claims. Please be advised. Let's talk about jokes. Like I said, Long Story Short is a more subtle show in terms of comedy when compared to BoJack, a show about an anthropomorphic animal. A show like Bob's Burgers, on the other hand, is more grounded than this. I find it interesting how the comedy stylings of this show work in relation to BoJack Horseman. While BoJack begins very silly, very punny, leaning into the whole animals as people thing just to subvert expectations when it first dives into its darker, heavier subject matter, Long Story Short, on the other hand, ramps up to the more cartoonish elements as they go. You wouldn't expect watching episode 1 that by episode 6 they would be dealing with wolves that moved into the high school during COVID, and everybody is kind of just living with that. But like I said, they build to it. The first 2 episodes are very grounded, but episode 3 gets zanier, with Yoshi trying to sell mattresses that pop out of tubes. That kind of weird gig is why I said Yoshi has shades of Todd, because they are both oddballs lost in life, trying to find their way, one crazy adventure at a time. What's great is that as Long Story Short gets into odder plot elements, they never lose track of the fact that the show is about the emotional core of the characters. The wolves, for example, are just a crazy way to dig into the fact that Avi is having trouble navigating being a dad when he didn't get that nurturing from his parents. All in all, I think that this is a great first season of a show. It is deeply layered in a way that I appreciate, and has plenty of room to build more onto it as it progresses. We already know that the show is getting a second season, and apparently they have already laid a few small bits to be picked up in season 2, and that is pretty exciting. It's also just nice watching a Netflix show knowing that they've already greenlit more, since they love just pulling the plug on their shows early. If you haven't seen Long Story Short yet, I hope you check it out. And if you have, let me know what you think. Please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, have a good one.